Betrayal never begins in the open square. It begins in the quiet corners of trust. It rarely comes from enemies at the gate. It comes from those seated closest at the table, the ones whose counsel shaped your choices and whose loyalty you never doubted. That is what makes it cut deeper than any blade. In the golden age of King David's reign, when Israel's borders stretched wide and the throne stood secure, there was a man whose voice carried weight like gold. He was not a prophet nor a warrior, but when he spoke, kings bent their ears. His name was Ahithophel, from the quiet town of Gilo, and scripture records that the advice he gave was considered as if one inquired of God himself. Few men in history ever commanded such reverence. If David was the heart of the kingdom, Ahithophel was the mind sharp, discerning a strategist whose words could tilt the balance of power. His legacy should have been one of honor, his story one of wisdom passed down through generations. And yet, behind the veil of brilliance, a wound festered, a wound that would one day drive him to a betrayal so shocking that David himself trembled when he heard of it. The wound began not with politics, but with family. Ahithophel's granddaughter was Bathsheba, a woman of striking beauty whose story would shake the kingdom to its core. David, the king who loved God, who wrote psalms of worship one evening, looked upon her, desired her, and took her. She belonged to another, a loyal soldier named Uriah. But David, blinded by passion, seduced her, and when her pregnancy threatened to expose him, he arranged Uriah's death on the battlefield. It was sin wrapped in deceit, power cloaked in lust, and though David confessed, repented, and found forgiveness from God, not everyone forgot. Imagine what it meant for Ahithophel, the trusted counselor, to watch the king dishonor his house, to see his granddaughter taken, and his grandson-in-law murdered by royal command. In an honor-driven culture, this was not just a scandal, it was a disgrace carved into family memory. Forgiveness may have been spoken in the courts of heaven, but bitterness took root in the halls of Gilo. Outwardly, nothing changed. Ahithophel remained the king's counselor, his wisdom sought in matters of war and peace. But bitterness rarely shouts it, whispers slowly reshaping loyalty into suspicion, grief into resentment. Like iron left in the rain, his heart began to corrode from the inside. Years would pass, yet the wound remained unhealed. Scripture gives us no record of conversations between Ahithophel and David about Bathsheba, but silence often speaks louder than words. Every decision David made, every triumph he celebrated, may have carried in Ahithophel's mind the shadow of betrayal that had once struck his family. And when opportunity came, when another voice began to rise against David, Ahithophel's bitterness would awaken with deadly clarity. This is the paradox of wisdom. Brilliance of mind does not protect a wounded heart. You can be gifted, admired, indispensable, and yet undone by bitterness left to rot. Ahithophel's story begins in reverence with his counsel compared to the very voice of God. But even the wisest advisor, if consumed by unforgiveness, can transform into the most dangerous traitor. His legacy, which should have been honor, was already being shaped by the wound he refused to heal. The stage was set, the bitterness buried deep, and soon the rising ambition of Absalom would give Ahithophel the chance to turn his wound into vengeance. Absalom was everything a restless nation could want in a prince, tall, strikingly handsome, with a charm that melted suspicion into loyalty. Scripture says no man in Israel was praised for his beauty as Absalom was. From the crown of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Yet beauty was only the beginning of his arsenal. He understood the art of image. He procured chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him, creating the aura of majesty wherever he went. At the city gate, where justice was sought and disputes were settled, Absalom rose early each day to meet the people. He would inquire about their grievances, listen with sympathetic nods, and then plant the subtle seed. Your case is valid, but there is no representative of the king to hear you. If only I were judge in the land, then everyone would receive justice. And when citizens bowed in respect, he pulled them close and kissed them, blurring the line between royalty and kinship. In this way, with gestures that felt personal and promises that sounded righteous, Absalom stole the hearts of Israel. It was a calculated campaign, a slow-burning conspiracy that took 4 years to mature. And when the time was ripe, Absalom approached his father with a request draped in piety, "Let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow to the Lord." David, unaware of the hidden plot, released him in peace. But once in Hebron, the trumpet-sounded messengers spread across the land, and the cry rang out, "Absalom is king." In an instant, Israel was divided. The people's allegiance shifted, swelling the ranks of rebellion. And with this uprising came a choice for every man of influence: remain loyal to David, or throw in their lot with his son. It was then that Ahithophel made his fateful decision. He abandoned the king he had long counseled and joined Absalom's camp. Why, some may argue, ambition aligning with the younger, more charismatic heir. But the deeper wound of Bathsheba's scandal, the bitterness that had quietly grown in him, made the choice almost inevitable. This was his chance at retribution cloaked as strategy. By standing with Absalom, he was not just changing political sides, he was striking back at David, the man who had stained his family's honor. To David, the news was like a dagger. When word reached him that Ahithophel was among the conspirators, he fled Jerusalem in haste, not simply fearing Absalom's army, but trembling at the thought of Ahithophel's mind now turned against him. For who knew his weaknesses better than the counselor who had once been his closest ally? History has seen this pattern before, and after the advisor who turns traitor, the strategist whose knowledge of the throne becomes the greatest weapon against it. Think of Brutus in the Roman Senate, a trusted son of the Republic, striking Caesar with the very intimacy that made betrayal possible. Or of royal courts across medieval Europe, where counselors once indispensable defected to rivals when their loyalty soured. Ahithophel's betrayal was part of this long, tragic lineage. Great wisdom twisted by personal grievance is more dangerous than open hostility. David, barefoot and weeping as he ascended the Mount of Olives, understood the peril. He prayed desperately, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." It was not Absalom's beauty or popularity that struck fear into David's heart. It was Ahithophel's brilliance now wielded in service of vengeance. The rebellion was more than a son's ambition. It had become the perfect storm: Absalom's charm, the people's discontent, and Ahithophel's wounded wisdom joining forces against Israel's king. Ahithophel wasted no time. The moment his allegiance shifted to Absalom, his counsel dripped with both brilliance and cruelty. His first piece of advice was not merely strategic, it was scandalous. He urged Absalom to take David's concubines, the women left behind in the palace, and to lie with them publicly upon the roof. This was more than an act of lust. It was a political statement, a declaration that Absalom had seized what belonged to the king. In ancient Near Eastern culture, such an act was the ultimate insult, a way of saying, "The throne is mine, and I humiliate the one who held it before me." And Absalom obeyed. A tent was pitched, and before all Israel, he defiled the concubines of his father. The air was thick with shock and awe, for the rebellion was no longer rumor, it was carved into the very honor of the king. But Ahithophel was not done. His next counsel was chilling in its precision. Choose 12,000 men and pursue David tonight. Attack while he is weary and discouraged. Strike terror into the camp. Kill only the king, and the people will return to you. cold, swift, decisive such was Ahithophel's genius. No drawn-out war, no bloodshed of thousands, just one surgical blow against David himself. It was a plan that could have ended the rebellion before it truly began. Absalom and his elders nodded in approval. The strategy was flawless. The rebellion seemed unstoppable. Yet in the shadows of desperation, David's prayer lingered, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And God answered through the most unlikely of means. Hushai, David's friend, sent back into Jerusalem as a spy planted like a seed in Absalom's court. When asked for his opinion, Hushai countered Ahithophel's ruthless logic with a portrait designed to stir fear. You know your father. He and his men are fierce like a bear robbed of her cubs. Even now he hides in a cave waiting to strike. If you attack too soon and suffer loss, the people's courage will fail. Then with a subtle stroke of vanity, Hushai offered an alternative. Gather all Israel as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Lead them yourself. March in grandeur and let the glory be yours. The trap was set. Absalom, intoxicated by the idea of leading a grand army, chose Hushai's counsel over Ahithophel's. Pride blinded him to wisdom. Vanity eclipsed strategy. The moment the words left his lips, Ahithophel knew it was over. The rebellion had lost its sharp edge. Delay would give David time to regroup, to rally his men to strike back with the cunning of a seasoned warrior. What had been certain victory was now slipping into inevitable defeat. History often turns on such fragile hinges. One leader seduced by flattery, one brilliant plan discarded for the promise of glory. Napoleon's hesitation before Waterloo generals who ignored sound advice in favor of vanity kings who mistook pride for power, all echo this ancient scene. And just like them, Absalom's choice would unravel his uprising. But for Ahithophel, the blow was personal. To be dismissed to have his wisdom scorned was more than rejection. For a man whose words were once regarded as the very voice of God, it was humiliation, a shattering of identity. The rebellion he had staked his bitterness upon was doomed, and with it, his name. When the news reached him that his counsel had been cast aside, Ahithophel understood instantly what it meant. Others may have still believed Absalom had a chance, but he knew better. The rebellion was already over in spirit. David, though wounded and on the run, would recover. The king was too seasoned, too favored by God to be destroyed by hesitation. Absalom's vanity had sealed his downfall, and Ahithophel's brilliance, once his greatest weapon, had been silenced. For a man whose words were regarded as if they came from God himself, rejection was unbearable. His pride cracked, and his heart collapsed beneath the weight of bitterness, humiliation, and despair. Scripture tells us with stark simplicity, Ahithophel saddled his donkey, returned to his home in Gilo, set his house in order, and hanged himself. No battle, no negotiation, no redemption, only silence and a rope. In that final act, we see not just a man undone by circumstance, but a legacy consumed by unforgiveness. Suicide in the ancient world often carried meanings of honor or final control, but here it reads more like resignation. Ahithophel could not live without influence, nor could he live with the humiliation of being dismissed. His mind, so sharp in counsel, proved helpless against the storm of bitterness in his soul. In his death, Ahithophel joins a tragic lineage of betrayers. Centuries later, another man, Judas Iscariot, would betray the son of David, and when his plan crumbled into shame, he too would hang himself. The echoes are chilling. Two men close to God's anointed, two men wielding influence, two men consumed by bitterness or greed, ending their lives in despair. The wisdom of Ahithophel should have been his crown, but without humility, it became a weapon against himself. His name could have been remembered alongside prophets and righteous counselors, but instead it is a warning. David may have captured this grief in Psalm 41:9. Even my close friend, one whom I trusted, who shared my bread, has turned against me. Those words ring with the pain of betrayal, intimate, cutting, unforgettable. And yet, even in the face of betrayal, David turned upward, trusting God to carry him through. That is the contrast. Ahithophel leaned on his own wisdom until it broke him. David leaned on God's mercy and found restoration. The lesson is sharp and timeless. Wisdom without the fear of God is dangerous. Bitterness left unchecked corrodes even the brightest gifts. Influence without humility becomes poison. Ahithophel teaches us that unforgiveness is not passive. It grows, it shapes choices, it distorts vision, until the wound becomes the only lens through which life is seen. And if left unchecked, it will destroy not just relationships, but the very person who carries it. For us today, the warning is clear. Unforgiveness may feel justified, even righteous when we have been wronged. But in the end, it does not chain our enemy, it chains us. The bitterness that drove Ahithophel to betray and then to despair is the same bitterness that lurks whenever we nurse a wound instead of surrendering it to God. His story reminds us that revenge may feel like strength, but forgiveness is the only path to freedom. Ahithophel began as a man whose words carried the weight of heaven. He ended as a man crushed under the weight of his own bitterness. His brilliance could not save him. His pride could not sustain him. His legacy is not wisdom remembered, but wisdom wasted. And so his story whispers across the ages, guard your heart, forgive, quickly walk humbly, for even the wisest can fall when bitterness takes root.